The hunt is on for the next White House chief of staff. Democrats are claiming the shakeup is proof the administration is in turmoil. But the question remains, is President Trump actually his own best chief of staff? Over the weekend, we learned that current Chief John Kelly will be stepping down by the end of the year. He's been on the job since July of 2017, and that's just shy of a year and a half, which in reality is a very long time to hold that position. But you'd never know that if you listen to the doom and gloom on mainstream media. Last night, the president tweeted, quote, "I am in the process of interviewing some really great people for the position of White House Chief of Staff. Fake news has been saying with certainty it was Nick Ayers, a spectacular person who will always be with our #MAGA agenda. I will be making a decision soon." Ayers was Vice President Mike Pence's Chief of Staff. Very young, very Trumpian hair. He was seen as a top contender, but he's leaving the White House altogether to run a super PAC for the president's re-election campaign. So who does that leave in the running? According to reports, the short list includes House Freedom Caucus Chair Mark Meadows, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, and White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney. Mulvaney is reportedly on the fence about it, and Mnuchin is said to be very happy in his current role. So back to the original question, if the president is his own best chief of staff, are the claims of the White House chaos just overblown? Joining me now, former Trump campaign manager and co-author of Trump's Enemies, Corey Lewandowski is back. Welcome back, Corey.
Thank you for having me.
So what does the next chief of staff need that the last ones have lacked?
Well, I think the next chief of staff needs to be a person who understands what's at stake in the 2020 election cycle, and candidly, who embraces the "let Trump be Trump" agenda, that mantra, which is get the president out in front of the people. He's his best communication spokesman. He's his best person when he wants to go out and message things. So let's not put this president behind the desk. Let's put him out in front of the people. And there are two very important components that the next chief of staff needs to have. Number one, an eye on the 2020 re-election. But number two, understanding the subpoena cannon, which is about to be faced to the White House from the Democrats in Congress, and what they're going to face with that. So you need a person who understands both sides of that in order to make this White House successful.
Conceivably understands how the House of Representatives works. So if that is the most key component, would you say that Mark Meadows is the best person for the job?
Well, Mark's clearly an excellent person for the job. He's somebody who's on the Trump agenda. There's no question about it. But I also look, and I'm selfish, look, Dave Bossie, as the co-author of my book, was the chief investigator on the Hill. He was the deputy campaign manager of the campaign. He knows both sides of these things, and he's a person who brings sides together to get things done.
Well, you also have to act as a filter, which was one of John Kelly's prime roles when he became chief of staff, was keeping certain people out of the Oval Office, which cut down on leaks and distraction for the president. I think you could say that that was essentially a good thing. You talk about someone who needs to understand the political atmosphere, also someone who respects the president's temperament. It sounds like you're describing Kellyanne Conway. Why isn't her name being bandied about for that role?
You know, I don't know if she has an interest. Look, she has the same issue that Nick has. She's got young children. I don't know if she wants that role, to be honest with you. I haven't spoken to her about it. I think she'd be a great choice, but I also think, look, other choices could include Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey,
he would be
who's known the president a long time.
I'll tell you why he wouldn't be good. He's way too thin-skinned. He is. He responds to criticism. He's too much of a hothead, and he likes to insert himself. The best chiefs of staff are ones who do allow the president to flourish. And with all due respect, I don't think Chris Christie has that in his DNA.
Well, you do want someone who understands the legal jeopardies that supposedly are facing this administration, and someone who understands the political realities. Look, I think Kellyanne could be a good choice. Also, outside the box, Dina Powell, who served in the administration, who has a nice relationship with the president, could come back and potentially serve. Look, there's a lot of options, and I would encourage the president to take some time and don't rush this decision, because John Kelly is not leaving the building till the end of the year, so he's got at least 3 weeks.
You know it's December 10th, right?
Well, I do, and look, I
time.
know the president's going to make a good decision, but don't rush the decision. Whether it's Mark Meadows, Dave Bosse, Kellyanne Conway, Dina Powell, Chris Christie, there are people there. There are many, many people.
This is someone who is chief of staff at the Department of Justice for the Attorney General. He's the interim Attorney General. His name has been thrown around a little bit, but still remains on the periphery. But he seems like the kind of person who at least has the personality for the job, because you have to talk to a lot of people. I don't think Steve Mnuchin wants to rub elbows with the GP.
Well, look, I don't know Whitaker, but I do know this. I'm not sure what his experience is in the legislative side of things or the political side of things. And going into a 2020 re-election effort, you need to have a chief of staff like a Rahm Emanuel, like an Andy Carter or Karl Rove, who understood what was at stake in the re-election effort. And that has to be a focus of inside the building.
Would you do it?
Look, I would do whatever the president asked me, but I think there's much better people than me. And if the right person were to go there, obviously, I think I'm a good advocate from the outside, and I love being able to support him on your show, Kennedy.
Corey Lewandowski, thank you very much.